Okay, so we're diving deep today into a period that I know a lot of you have been asking about, the Moorish rule in Spain.
Yeah, this is always a really popular topic.
And it's centuries, right? We're not talking about a short little period here.
No, absolutely. It had a huge impact.
And you sent over a document called History of the Conquest of Spain by the Arab Moors. So we're going to use that as like our jumping off point today to explore.
Perfect source, I think, to really dig into this.
Yeah, and figure out, how this period shaped Spain, how it impacted Europe, and kind of the whole story from beginning to end.
Definitely. I think it really paints a vivid picture of this whole era.
So the document kicks off right away with the military actions, like the initial conquest.
Yeah, and we see early battles mentioned, even one near Toulouse, which is interesting because even though they were defeated, the text talks about them as martyrs for the faith. So it's showing that strong religious motivation right from the start.
Right away, yeah. Like even in defeat, there's this greater purpose.
Exactly, and it kind of sets the stage for how these early conflicts played out north of the Pyrenees.
Okay, so let's talk about one of those early battles that seems pretty key, even in defeat, to understand their mindset. And the text mentions Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours.
Oh yeah, that's a big one.
Big name, right? And our source actually points out that historians differ on just how important it was. We've got Martin on one side and Freeman on the other. So what's the difference in their interpretations? And what can we learn from that kind of historical debate?
Well, it's fascinating to see how they each frame the Battle of Tours. You've got Martin, who seems to believe that if Charles Martel hadn't won that battle, then Gaul, modern-day France, would have ended up just like Spain under Moorish rule.
Wow, so like a decisive turning point.
Exactly. But then Freeman comes along, and he's a bit more cautious. He says, yeah, it was a big early loss for the Saracens, a major battle against the Christians. But he doesn't think it was the only thing that saved Gaul.
So more nuance, less like a single event decided everything.
Right, and the text even brings up an Arab writer named Isidorus Pecensis, who described Tours as a total disaster for the Moors.
So different perspectives even from within.
Yeah, though our source points out that not all historians agree with Pecensis's take on it.
So I guess what we can learn from this is that even these big famous battles are open to interpretation. It's not always a simple story.
Totally. History's always being reinterpreted, right?
Hmm.
We look back with new perspectives and new evidence.
So true. So despite these early battles and maybe debates about their impact, the Moorish presence in Spain grew stronger and stronger. So the source hints at the motivations for this expansion. What were some of the driving forces at play according to this text?
Well, I think there are a few things we can pick out from what it says. Like we saw with those early martyrs, there was definitely a religious component, this idea of spreading the faith. But it also mentions this period of ambition, like a desire to establish power and influence over new territories.
So faith and empire building kind of going hand in hand.
It's a really interesting mix.
Yeah, so once they'd conquered these new lands, they had to figure out how to actually govern them, right? The text outlines the early administrative divisions of Moorish Spain. So what did that look like? How did they structure their rule?
So they divided into 5 main sections: Andalusia, Toledo, Saragossa, Tarragona, and Septimania. And Andalusia, which used to be the Roman province of Baetica, that was a really crucial one. It's got the fertile Guadalquivir Valley and access to the Mediterranean. The text even lists out some of the major cities within Andalusia, places like Cordova, Seville, Malaga, even Granada.
Wow, so they were already setting up these key centers.
Yeah, and those administrative divisions helped them manage such a huge and diverse territory. It was a way to impose some order on their new domain.
And of course, Cordova becomes the big one, right? Abdurrahman, the first Adakal, makes it the capital. And the text mentions that he wanted to rival Baghdad, the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. That's a pretty bold ambition. What does that tell us about their vision for Moorish Spain?
It tells us that they weren't just content with military power. They wanted to be a center of culture and learning, too, like a beacon in the west to compete with the Abbasids in the east.
So like a clash of civilizations almost.
In a way, yeah. And that ambition led to a lot of investment in infrastructure in the arts and sciences in Cordova. It set the stage for its golden age.
Really interesting. So, of course, when one group comes to rule another, a big question is how they treat the existing population. The source talks about Islam coexisting with the faith of Gaul, which refers to Christianity.
Yeah, it's interesting because the source also presents the Christian perspective on this. They saw Islamic civilization as a move away from the spiritual and divine to the sensuous and human.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty stark contrast.
Yeah, it really highlights this clash of values and worldviews. Like the Christians saw the emphasis on earthly pleasures, scientific inquiry, and human achievement, as somehow straying from their spiritual focus.
Right, so there was definitely resistance to this new dominant culture.
Without a doubt.
But the text later gives us a more nuanced view. It mentions these Christian and Jewesses who were famous female poets, and it talks about the legal provision for Muslim men to marry Christians or Jewesses. So, what do those details tell us about daily life and the interaction between different religious communities?
I think it shows that the reality was much more complex than just a clash of civilizations.
Hmm.
For example, the fact that Christian and Jewish women were recognized as poets suggests they were participating in the broader culture, at least in the arts.
Right, so there was some level of integration.
Yeah, and even the laws about interfaith marriage, while they are within a specific framework, it still points to interaction and a degree of acceptance between religious groups.
So, not total segregation, but a more complicated picture.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move on to what many people consider the most remarkable part of this period, the intellectual and cultural flourishing that happened in Spain. The source emphasizes the advancements made by the Moors, especially during a time when much of Europe outside of this region was in what we often call the Dark Ages.
Yeah, it's a stark contrast.
Huge contrast, and the text mentions schools and libraries being set up. They even mention Fez in Africa as part of this wider movement. So what was the significance of this focus on learning?
Well, the fact that they were building all these schools and libraries shows that they were really dedicated to knowledge and scholarship. Even though Fez was in North Africa, it's still part of this broader intellectual energy that was happening across the Islamic world at the time. And in Moorish Spain, particularly in Cordova, under rulers like Al-Hakim, they built these incredible libraries. Our source suggests they were unmatched anywhere else in the world.
So they were really at the forefront of knowledge preservation and creation.
Absolutely. And those centers of learning were vital for preserving classical knowledge, translating texts, and fostering new intellectual pursuits. It was a period of incredible growth.
And it led to some major contributions in different fields. Let's start with philosophy. The text mentions figures like Alfarabi's Avicenna and Averroes. What kind of impact did they have?
These were some of the most influential thinkers of their time. They played a huge role in transmitting and interpreting Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle's work. Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, was a major figure in both philosophy and medicine. His work was incredibly important.
Two for one.
Exactly. And Averroes, also known as Ibn Rushd. He's famous for his in-depth commentaries on Aristotle, which actually had a big influence on medieval European thought. Some of his ideas were even seen as controversial.
So shaking things up a bit.
Yeah, and the text even says that Averroes was an instructor to kings, so that shows how philosophical thought wasn't just theoretical, it had practical applications too.
Really cool. Okay, how about history? What does our source say about the historical writing that was going on at the time?
Well, it points out that Spanish Arabians produced a lot of historical writing, especially in the form of chronicles, and it links this to a doctrine of fatalism.
Okay, so that's interesting. How might that belief have influenced how they wrote history?
Well, if you believe that events are basically predetermined, then you might focus more on simply recording what happened rather than analyzing cause and effect. Like chronicles, which present things in chronological order, would fit with that.
Makes sense. And the source mentions a specific collection of writings found in the library at the Escorial called Collection of the Flowers of the Gardens on the Merits of Illustrious Men.
Right, so it seems like they were often focusing on notable individuals and their actions within this framework of destiny.
Okay, moving on to math. The introduction of the Arabic numeral system, including the concept of zero, was revolutionary. The text also talks about the development of algebra and work on cubic equations. So how did these advancements change things?
Well, the Arabic numeral system, with its positional notation and the inclusion of zero, made calculation way more efficient. It allowed for a much more complex math to be done. And algebra, with its methods for solving equations, gave them new tools for abstract reasoning and problem solving.
So like a whole new way of thinking about math.
Exactly, and when they started exploring cubic equations, that was way beyond the mathematical knowledge that existed in the West at the time.
So they were really pushing the boundaries. Okay, let's talk about astronomy. What progress did they make in understanding the universe?
Well, they took Ptolemy's Almagest, which was his ancient Greek text on astronomy, and they didn't just preserve it, they built on it. They made new observations, corrected errors, and refined our understanding of the cosmos. And the fact that they were building observatories not just in the East, but in places like Seville and Cordova, shows how committed they were to using empirical observation to learn about the heavens.
So not just theory, but actually looking at the stars.
Exactly. And that led to more accurate astronomical tables and a much better understanding of how celestial bodies move.
And all this scientific knowledge had practical uses, right? especially in geography. The text mentions how accurate and practical their geography was. How did those other advancements contribute to that?
They were able to create much more precise and useful maps because they were applying mathematical principles to map making and using astronomical observations for navigation. And those maps were essential for trade travel and administration across their vast territories.
Right, so it all comes together.
Absolutely.
Okay, what about chemistry? What does the source say about that?
It mentions that they had an early understanding of distillation
Yeah.
and that they were preparing all sorts of chemical substances.
So like the beginnings of experimental science.
Yeah. Their work with distillation was really important because it allows you to separate and purify substances. And their experiments with different chemical substances show this early form of scientific inquiry, which really laid the groundwork for future advances in the field.
Very cool. And we can't forget about medicine. The text talks about how influential Arabian physicians were. Their translated works were used in European medical schools for centuries, and it names a few key figures like Serapion Nerisis, Avicenna, and Averroes. What made their contributions so important?
These physicians had a huge impact on medicine. Their medical treatises became standard textbooks in European universities for hundreds of years. Figures like Avicenna, whose canon of medicine was incredibly influential, and Rhasis, who had this vast medical knowledge, they really shaped medical theory and practice. The source even mentions their advances in dissection, which suggests they were taking a much more direct and empirical approach to understanding the human body.
Mm.
That was pretty groundbreaking for the West.
So ahead of their time in a lot of ways.
For sure.
It's amazing how something as basic as paper can be so important. The text talks about the Saracens' knowledge of paper made from linen rags, and it emphasizes the quality. So how did that impact the spread of knowledge?
Well, the introduction of high-quality paper that was relatively cheap to produce was a game changer. It was so much easier to make and distribute than parchment, which was the main writing material before that. So more books could be made, knowledge became more accessible, and that really contributed to the explosion of intellectual activity we've been talking about.
So a seemingly small thing that had a huge impact. And it wasn't just intellectual stuff. The Moors also changed the landscape with agriculture. They brought in new crops like rice, cotton, and sugarcane, which later spread to the Americas. That's a huge global impact.
Yeah, those innovations not only enriched the Iberian Peninsula and led to new industries and trade routes, but when they spread to the Americas centuries later, it transformed global agriculture and economies.
Yeah.
It's a great example of how innovations in one place can have ripple effects all over the world.
Absolutely. So to really get a sense of the scale of Moorish civilization, we have to talk about Cordova. The source describes it in detail. How big it was, its infrastructure, like the aqueduct built by Abdurrahman III, the countless mosques and baths, and just its overall importance as a cultural and intellectual hub. It says it was the largest and most splendid city in the world at its peak. What are some details that really bring that to life?
The descriptions of Cordova are just amazing. This city that stretched for miles with a sophisticated water system like the aqueduct, so many public baths, which shows a high level of hygiene, and countless mosques, which speaks to the importance of religious life. It was a truly advanced urban center for its time. Its scale and complexity were unlike anything else in Europe.
Really paints a picture of a thriving metropolis.
Yeah, and then there's the Caliph's palace. The source talks about these fountains with figures made of gilt bronze and green marble walls, covered in marble, and even a roof made of some kind of transparent material. It sounds incredibly luxurious.
So they spared no expense.
Not at all. These details, even if they've been embellished a bit over time, still show us the immense wealth and artistic skill that went into creating this seat of power. They wanted it to be impressive.
Right, a real statement of power and prestige. And beyond the grand palaces and mosques, the text also gives us glimpses into everyday life. How the houses were designed with inner courtyards and gardens, the bathing habits, the dining customs, even the changes in clothing, like the adoption of the tarbouch or fez with different colors for different religious groups. It really helps us imagine what it would have been like to live there.
It does. It shows a society that valued comfort aesthetics and social customs. Those inner courtyards and gardens would have been a private escape from the hustle and bustle. Bathing was clearly important both for hygiene and social reasons. And even the way clothing styles evolved shows how the different religious and cultural groups were interacting and distinguishing themselves. Like that color-coded fez, it points to social distinctions, but also to the recognition of different religious groups within the society.
Fascinating. Okay, last thing on governance. The source mentions the system under the caliph and the roles of wazirs and hagibs. It seems like a fairly centralized system, at least in those early powerful years.
Yeah, the caliph was the ultimate authority, But to actually run such a vast and diverse territory, they needed a strong bureaucracy. Officials like the wazirs, who oversaw different parts of the government, and the hagibs, who were like chief ministers managing important state affairs, they were essential for keeping things running smoothly.
So like a well-oiled machine.
In the best of times, yeah.
But as with any empire, Moorish Spain didn't stay unified forever. The source talks about how it eventually broke apart into these smaller, often warring kingdoms. And while it doesn't give us every single cause, it does show a period of internal conflict and challenges to that central authority.
Right, it's a gradual process, but there were a lot of factors that contributed to it.
So one of the early events mentioned is the overthrow of the Umayyads in Damascus and the rise of the Abbasid Caliphate in the east. How did that distant event impact Spain?
Well, it was a huge turning point. The Abbasid revolution in Damascus meant the end of the Umayyad dynasty, and they were pretty brutal about it. Abdurrahman I, who was an Umayyad prince, he managed to escape and fled to Spain. He established an independent Umayyad emirate there, which later became the Caliphate of Cordova. So in a way, it was this act of defiance against the Abbasids. It created a new center of power in the West, but it also meant that the Islamic world was now politically divided.
So a ripple effect across the entire region.
Definitely.
And on top of that, there were rebellions and challenges to authority within Spain itself. The text mentions the revolt in Merida as an example. That must have weakened the central government over time.
Oh, absolutely. Those internal rebellions showed that the rulers in Cordova weren't always in complete control. They had to deal with different factions within Spain who were willing to challenge them. And those conflicts took a toll. They diverted resources, both people and money, and created instability that made them more vulnerable.
So cracks were starting to show.
Yeah, and it seems like after Abdurrahman III, who was a really powerful ruler, the Umayyad Caliphate started to experience its own internal problems. There were assassinations, power struggles, and the rise of figures who, as the text says, were never more than kings of Cordova.
So the power and prestige of the central rulers was declining.
Yeah, that's a key point. That weakening of the central caliphate created a power vacuum. Ambitious local governors and regional leaders saw their chance to assert their independence. And that's how the once unified caliphate fragmented into all these smaller independent kingdoms called taifas.
Right, so internal divisions were tearing them apart.
Exactly, and the text even mentions the capture and execution of Al-Qasim, which really highlights that instability and breakdown of central authority.
So it's not just abstract forces at play, but real people and power struggles.
Yeah, these were individuals with their own ambitions, and they were willing to fight for them.
And you can see that ambition in figures like Al-Hussein ibn Yahya and Suleiman ibn Yoktan of Saragossa. They even tried to form alliances with the Frankish king, who was a Christian ruler to the north. It seems like they saw themselves as totally independent.
Their actions definitely show that they were less loyal to Cordova and more interested in their own regional power. And the fact that they were willing to work with the Franks, who were a major external power, shows just how weak the central authority had become. These local rulers were putting their own interests first.
Right, so a complete shift in the balance of power.
Yeah, and the text also hints at how internal societal factors played a role in this decline. It uses words like torpor vices, division, dissension, segregation.
So it sounds like there was this internal decay happening alongside the external pressures.
It's a pretty common pattern when empires decline. You get internal divisions, corruption, a weakening of social bonds, and a lack of shared purpose. And that erodes the foundation of the state, making it vulnerable to both internal conflict and threats from outside.
It's like a perfect storm.
Yeah, exactly.
So finally, we reach the end of Moorish rule with the fall of Granada in 1492 under Ferdinand and Isabella. The source describes it as the ejection of a tenant whose lease had already expired. So that suggests a long decline leading up to this final event.
It's a really interesting way to put it. It implies that the conditions that had allowed Moorish rule to flourish in Spain had been eroding for centuries, and that the fall of Granada was really just the inevitable conclusion.
So it was more of a symbolic ending than a sudden collapse?
In a way, yeah. The groundwork had been laid long before.
And the source goes on to talk about what happened after the fall. It mentions that thousands of Moors sought refuge in the south of France and later became Huguenots, and some of them apparently even ended up in South Carolina. That's a pretty specific claim about what happened to them.
It is, and it's important to remember that while there was a big exodus of Muslims from Spain after the Reconquista, this specific claim about large numbers converting to Protestantism in France and then going to South Carolina would need to be backed up by other historical sources. It's presented as one possible path for some of those who fled Spain and then faced religious persecution elsewhere. but it's not necessarily representative of everyone's experience.
Right, so more research is needed to confirm that.
Exactly.
And the text ends on a pretty critical note. It says that Spain then brought Spanish errors and especially Spanish bigotry to the New World, while Protestant Europe also rushed in.
Yeah, it's a pretty pointed commentary on what happened after the Reconquista. It's comparing the impact of Spanish colonization in the Americas to what other European powers were doing. It suggests that the end of Moorish rule in Spain had these ripple effects that went way beyond the Iberian Peninsula.
So their legacy is a complicated one. Okay, so to wrap up our deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground. We started with the Moorish conquest of Spain, then looked at how they set up their administration and the amazing intellectual and cultural flourishing that happened under their rule. We talked about the treatment of Jews and Christians and all those incredible advancements they made in science, math, medicine, and agriculture. And finally, we explored the factors that led to the fragmentation of Moorish Spain and ultimately the fall of Granada.
Yeah, it's been a whirlwind tour through centuries of history.
It really has. And I think what's most striking is how interconnected everything is. The rise and fall of Moorish Spain involved interactions and influences that spanned continents and centuries. It makes you realize how much cultures collide and interact and shape each other, even when there's conflict and change. And it reminds us that history isn't just a series of events, it's a continuous process with legacies that last far beyond the immediate moment.
Absolutely.
Well, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into such a fascinating era. I hope you learned something new.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah.
Always happy to talk about this period of history.
All right, until next time.
See you then.